Good evening. Glad to be here this evening. So I am talking on behalf of a number of Parkside and North Forest Hills residents, and we are requesting a comprehensive shelter ordinance instead of the proposed LUMO deletion. I'll be happy to take questions at the end of the presentation, and I also have some additional slides that break out some details in case you have questions in those areas. The main issue is that taking the limit of 25 out of the ordinance basically takes out a protection, and we're not replacing it with anything concrete. We're leaving it completely up to a special use process, and many people have expressed in the previous hearing that we need to write the rules down. So 3 reasons not to amend the LUMO. This is kind of the outline of what I'm going to talk about tonight. The change is not warranted under Article 4.4. The Planning Board did not consider any impacts before making the LUMO recommendations, and we need to be developing a clear definition of shelter siting so that we can minimize land use conflicts. And to get into the not warranted under Article 4.4, I have more details at the end if you have questions, but basically there are 3 reasons of which I understand you need one, and the first reason that was cited was to correct a manifest error, and there is no manifest error in the sense that there's no record that other numbers were ever considered. In order to have a manifest error, you need to be able to point to a decision that was made previously. So for example, if you decided on a number 25 and they wrote 15 in the ordinance and you could point to the resolution, then you would have a manifest error. Or if you had some other gross error. And then the second would be that you had changed conditions in an area. The changed conditions that were cited, I disagree with, many disagree with. The relevant change conditions that need to be considered, the local ones are the fact that since that was enacted, there has been women's shelter, Freedom House. Freedom House has had an expansion. There's been an addition of recovery houses like Oxford houses. I'll give more details about that as we go along. Rainbow Heights. They've been added in this small area in Chapel Hill, and that needs to be considered. And the other is basically crime needs to be considered in the ordinance when we're making our planning decisions. The last item, to achieve the comprehensive plan, the proposed ordinance change does not promote the well-being of the community because it unfairly concentrates at-risk overnight social services in one area. And if you look at this next slide, this is important. I don't know if you can see the black triangle right here. But that's where every overnight at-risk social service would be placed. The corners of the triangle are the Freedom House drug detox. They take 1,200 or more patients a year. 600 are being detoxed. 600 are in recovery treatment. There's a women's shelter as one corner and the proposed men's shelter. And these are all the facilities of those kind in Orange County, and they're in that small area. So the ordinance, basically as it exists today, allows for this over-concentration of these overnight at-risk facilities. And we need these facilities, especially as Chris Moran said earlier. I mean, we need facilities right now that people can stay in for white flag nights, but that has a direct bearing on what type of location you're going to be in. So the Planning Board didn't consider several of the impacts that I would like to go through tonight. One is the crime statistics at current facilities. The men's shelter has the second most number of arrests in Chapel Hill since 2003. In the agenda materials, you can see details. I've listed all the crime that the police department has reported for that area. There's a website, nccrime.us. To be completely transparent, every single statistic that I'm talking about tonight is on that website. All the analytics, you can look at a map, you can see the crime that we're talking about, nccrime.us. If you look at person crimes, the men's shelter is 4th on the list in terms of places in person crime, assaults, things like that. If you look at any query on crime, the location of the men's shelter shows up in the top 10 or 15. If you talk to police officers off the record, they'll tell you they think it's nuts to put the shelter in the proposed location. And they would tell you stories, except they're not allowed to. There may be more instances associated with the shelter, but most of the crimes, if you look through the records, something that was kind of news to me when I was looking through this, that there are a lot of incidents and only very few of them have actually arrests that go with them, so there's no way to really track what's going on precisely. The women's shelter past incidents include assault and domestic disturbances and their impacts to neighborhoods and parks. If we look, I took a half square mile area. This is a half square mile is an area that I know that at least my family, we walk, we run, we play, we shop, we inhabit this area around our neighborhood. So I took the same area, half mile, and put it on 20 neighborhoods in Chapel Hill, and I calculated the crime in the area. This is a graph of person crime. It's not property crime. It's not people calling about a dog barking. This is assaults and things like that. Again, if you look on the website, you can see exactly what I'm talking about. And I was curious what crime occurs in the environment of each neighborhood. And basically, then I wanted to look at, and if you look in the orange to brown areas, the crime that's contributed by public facilities that have already been placed in this area that we're talking about. And you can see a couple of observations. I mean, every neighborhood in our town should be bearing the burden of providing for people that are at need in our community. But there's basically a balance that you have to have. And so it's evident here that, number one, those put these neighborhoods higher in the list based on the burden. And then, well, anyway, so we're bearing the burden. I guess I made that point. And then if you add the shelter crime, the crime at 100 West Rosemary. Now, one can argue where in this pink line the actual crime would be. It could even be beyond the pink line because this is only the crime at 100 West Rosemary. But somewhere in that line is where the crime is. And I don't know if you guys have read the book, The Tipping Point, but that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about pushing this group of neighborhoods past the tipping point. So these risks need to be taken into account in the ordinance. Now, the white flag nights that we're talking about now, they affect capacity. As Chris stated, he said they're running at 81. As a presentation yesterday, they said that they're running 35 overflow beds right now, and they've been as high as 81 overflow beds. And basically, men need to leave first thing in the morning, and so where will they go? This has a direct impact. We've talked about, or we've heard from the IFC that this is mainly a transitional facility, but yet we have emergency responsibilities in there, and the location wouldn't be so much of an issue if we were talking about a transitional facility, because we wouldn't have as many people coming in for the white flag nights and then being discharged the next morning. And Chris has stated in a public hearing in the past that, you know, the men who are discharged or leave the facility are basically someone else's problem, not the IFC's, and you know whose problem they are is the neighborhood. So you have to look at the big picture, not just the shelters there. There are these other facilities. So if we look at the role, a couple things to note here. In the orange area is white flag nights. So what we did is took RDU's weather data and IFC's criteria, and those are nights that are 40 or lower, days that are 95 or higher, or rain, and that gives you 233 white flag nights per year, 233. So that makes this more of an emergency shelter than it is a transitional shelter. So to begin with, there's 20 emergency beds and 30 transitional beds, and on the white flag nights in this smaller facility today, we're taking 35 to 81, and in a larger facility that's the size 16,000 square feet or 4 or 5 basketball courts, you can fit a lot of people in there. And then where do they go the next day? In the park that's nearby, the preschools. I mean, those are a concern, basically. And one other thing to note, I was talking to Lori the other day, and she informed me that the other transitional programs that this model is based on don't have an emergency bed or a white flag operation responsibility. And in part, that's because if you've got folks who are facing drug addiction and things like that, they don't need to be around bad influences of folks who may not be committed to the transitional program. Other impacts are the effect of the mental health budget and putting more demands on these facilities. We got to consider the fact that there are a lot of facilities that are undergoing expansion in place, and so this might happen to the shelter. Freedom House expanded. There are things that cause a magnetic effect. For example, Freedom House provides drug counseling, and in North Forest Hills there was one halfway house opened a couple years ago, a second one just opened on Stateside. There is a magnetic effect for counseling there, and to the extent that the new proposed men's shelter will have clinics and dental facilities and job counseling, it will be more magnetic effect into the area. And that's just something that you need to consider when you're concentrating a lot of social services that have a magnetic effect into one area. And that's something that the ordinance should consider. So, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't have that slide, but I talked to it. So